Hello dear Craftworldians and welcome to a new tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to paint a knight. And not just any knight, a rabbit knight. I know that you guys enjoy Sir Roderick's series that Marco painted, so we're gonna hop in with another knight with slightly longer ears and hairy face, a neck, and continue new lessons starting from non-metallic metal Armour, done in many colorful brushstrokes. Idea how you can place these brushstrokes to create the volumes of the Armour, how to shape them together, how to blend them together, and create big harmonious piece. Major difference with this series is that I will not use airbrush. In these lessons I will focus on brushstrokes use, light placement sketchings, and color harmony. Starting with his plate armor, let me guide you through our first lesson. Let's create tonal variations of paint mixes, starting with emerald green and primary blue. With mixing these two paints, I get a spectrum of tones in between emerald and cyan. By adding magenta, I create more variations. From purple tones to a clear magenta. And from primary blue to emerald. Also, by adding a mix of spring green and primary blue, I get a warm tonalities of blue values as well as cold tonalities of green values. For more of the warm values, I will use variation in between magenta and Naples yellow, creating orange and yellow tones. So with these tones I have lights, shades, as well as warm and cold midtones. To create lighter values of these tones, I can add vanilla white in warm tones and white paint in the colder colors. For the deepest shades, I will mix magenta and emerald green. Let's start with the first brushstrokes. I will use colder values of bluish green, made in a mix between emerald and primary blue. You can say I brighten the emerald tone using primary blue in creating a midtone. Sketch on the border between shades and lights. I'm applying these tones in a sketchy way, creating construction brushstrokes, building up the volume of the armor. By adding magenta into a mix, I define a pinkish plus violet shade in the lower area of the armor. By mixing spring green with blue paint, firstly I create neutral tone of greenish blue, not too warm, not too cold, to create a connection between the two torso sides. Following the midtone border in between light and shade, as you can see this curvy line. And I slowly add more of the spring green for the warmth. I apply violet values of the primary blue and magenta in the cold areas of the armor on the upper side, while I focus on more saturated clean magenta in the warmer areas of the light side of the armor. This way I am creating a frame of tonalities around the light area in the middle of the torso, as a midtone border, but also as a base tone of all the layers that will overlap. Light area is focused on the circular shape in the middle of the armor. And while focusing on the whole area, I also create a focus on two sides of the armor shapes and circular light shapes of each. Warm on one side and slightly colder on the other. Creating Naples yellow values in one area and turquoise in other. Even as one-side tonalities are cold, I am adding some of the warmer values to connect them with the warm side. Likewise, some of the cold tonalities appear in the warm side of the armor as well. The most important rule that I'm following with this process is, as I would do with underpainting, explaining the volumes with darker and lighter values and sketching the ambience with all the tones reflected in the armor. In this case, I don't have the underpainting done over the whole model, but I am still building the values from black and white sketch done in the priming stage. Once again, even as the sketch starts as loosely driven brushstrokes that just playfully describe the ambience and shapes, before I continue to other details, I will make sure to darken every detail and texture. Also, these brushstrokes are following the shapes of the light placements and shade placements, because all of these are reflections on the metal surface. Because this is a sketchy phase, I'm not too careful with the brushstrokes, but they are still following the path and creating these geometrical shapes of lights and shades, so I can showcase this definition of armor better for you all. Make sure to darken recesses and depths of the sculpt, so it gets easier to build other details up to light value when you have a good contrast in the base tone. If the details have deeper depth in the sculpt, you can dilute your paint to a thinner consistency and make sure to push pigments inside with your brush. When paint dries, if it shrinks and leaves some primer patches visible, make sure to repeat the process. Since the shoulder pad is in the upper side of the ambience affected by light values, I will start by choosing bright shade reflections first, and build up even brighter light reflections next to the shades, creating a contrast between these reflections just with a color play. When it comes to flat armor surfaces in the lower side, I will add a light reflection by following the light path described on the torso, and by creating saturated blue tonalities around the light on the left side, following the ideas of the tonality sketch and the colder violet and green tonalities on the right side, around the path of light. When we are satisfied with our sketch, we can proceed to a lighter values of the tonalities we were sketching in the previous progress. As I mentioned, I am adding white paint for colder tonalities and vanilla yellow plus white for warmer tonalities. Of course, I don't go into drastic contrast at once. Firstly, I am adding small amounts of brighter paint to my mixes, so I can brighten them step by step. This way, I can focus on better blends. Similar to a previous step, I'm still using brushstrokes, following the shapes of the lights, of tones and shades described before. This step is still a sketching phase, since, next to refining previously added brushstrokes, I will still add more midtones that will help me with describing volumes better, as well as help me in connecting all of these reflections to their shapes. I will correct some of the shadings for more depth and lights for a better shape. I am adding some of the vertical brushstrokes from the lower areas of the torso up to a border with light areas to boost the volume. Since the torso is popped out in the middle, meaning we need more lights in this area as well. Taking care of keeping the brushstrokes following the initial idea of light reflection spread and volume definition. As mentioned, following the geometrical shapes of lights and shades that in contrast build the volume of the armor. As I'm continuing to lighter values, I'm gradually adding vanilla white into a Naples yellow to brighten the lightest area. I am following the brushstrokes movement in circular shapes around the top highlight. But since I'm still building the lighter values, I'm still using wider brushstrokes that overlap, so they blend in with previous brushstrokes layers in lighter value and brighten up the tonalities around. I also added a bit of vanilla yellow to a primary blue, as mentioned, to connect the cold and warm side closer in the process of building light values. Some of these brushstrokes are thinner, diluted with more water, simply because tonalities with white paint are heavier, and I need a good flow of a brushstroke to lay over other layers and react by overlapping effect with other tonalities. On both cold and warm side, I follow one circular shape on the top light that spreads around in a gradient of tonalities and circular brushstrokes. In this step, I am refining the transitions between tonalities and I am creating blends. So it is very important to work with softer layers when it comes to this step and with finer brushstrokes. Finer brushstrokes means thinner and more controlled application of tones, keeping all progress done by now visible and creating better definition and blends in between. In some areas, closer in tonality value, the layers blend. In other areas, the layers are more visible and create a texture. In this case, the texture of polished metal. Soft brushstrokes also means that my layers are thinned to a finer consistency. This means that the paint is diluted to a nice flow, so not too much water, but enough to create a smooth brush movement and keep the good amount of pigments, or better said, paint density. These fine layers are applied for the refinements, but in some areas we will have a transition that requires more blending. This will require diluting a layer to a thinner consistency, so that this layer keeps transparency, a bit thicker than a glaze. By mixing the closest tones in between the transition that is blending and applying this thin layer, this tone overlaps and creates a finer gradient between the two values. When we arrive at a final refinement, it means that you're already satisfied with overall volumes, color interactions, transitions, gradients, and blends, as well as textures. Now we're about to boost up the details volumes by brightening the top highlights and defining the edges and shapes of the volumes. In this stage, I'm working forward to connect all the paths and shapes of the light placements into one harmonious whole. All of the patches of light reflections are connected by the edges of the shapes and little details around, keeping the shade reflection framed in between the light path. Since we need both shades and lights for a contrast and for a definition of the object we are painting. Luckily for non-metallics, it is always fun, as the surface of this material is reflective, creating a various interpretation methods to approach to its definition. Don't misjudge this phase. Even though it may appear as messy, it is intentional because it is the first idea of creation, and with this, we build the layers further. With later refinements, we can blend some details in and leave some in more sketchy definition, because that way we bring more values to the piece. Be careful with too much mixing of the paint on the model. Too much mixing will create the muddy look of the colors. The trick is to know when to stop. And to know when to stop is to build on experience. And the only way to achieve this is through practice and observing. I hope you will enjoy learning more about the blending, brushstrokes and tonal variations, as well as color mixing through use of this lesson and practice. Now, let's add final highlights on the shoulder pad. Following the sketch previously created for the volume, I am adding the brushstroke interpretation I did on the Armour, creating a blend in between tones by soft brushstrokes of close tonalities and connecting the light placements as they spread over the shoulder pad shape, creating better definition. And here he is, Rabbit Night Part 1. That will be all for today's lesson. Both Marco and I hope you enjoyed in this one, and we're looking forward to see your practices and results following this and other tutorials available on our Patreon.